Hi, everyone. We'll just take a moment as people arrive. Can we maybe just get everyone to turn off their mics while we're waiting, and as we get things started? Thanks. Okay. Well, look, we might just get started because we've only got an hour tonight, or today, depending on where you are. So I'll kick things off. So I just wanted to say hello and welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for our almost quarterly webinar for the Global Shelter Cluster Shelter Cash and Markets Community of Practice. As many of you are aware, this community practice exists as a space for practitioners and coordinators and technical specialists to connect, share learning, and strengthen approaches for cash and market-based programming in humanitarian shelter responses. So that's what we're hoping to do today. My name is Leanne Marshall. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Community of Practice, and I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you to the session today, which is focused on market assessment and analysis to inform shelter responses. So I'll quickly take you through the agenda, which is on the next slide, please. So very shortly, I will hand over to Jenny, who is going to make some opening remarks about why we are here today talking about market assessment. Along with, she will be introducing some of the key markets that we need to be aware of as shelter practitioners. Then we'll pass over to Chris from Reach, who will give us an overview of market assessment approaches also, and a bit more in depth, including types of market assessments and a bit of a comparison of tools. Then we have David from the Palestine Shelter Cluster, who will share with us a short case study presentation on a rapid rental market assessment methodology that is being planned for the West Bank. And finally, we hope to have at least 15 minutes to open up the floor for some questions and answers and a bit of open discussion where we'd love to hear from your reflections and experiences. So as we go along, as I mentioned before, if you could just keep your mics off if you're not talking, but please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know your name, where you're coming from and your role, but also any questions that you've got. As we go through the session, feel free to pop those in as we're talking. As I said, we've only got 1 hour, so it'd be great if we can collate those questions as we go through, and then when we get to that Q&A time at the end, we'll be able to bring them up straight away. And with that, I will hand over to Jenny for her opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Leanne, and welcome everybody again. I'm Jenny Weatherall. I'm the other co-facilitator of the Community of Practice. I work with CRS as a cash markets and food security technical advisor. And just to kind of scene set a little bit before we dive into Chris's presentation that will give us a much deeper run through of different market assessment methodologies, I just wanted to kind of reflect briefly about why are we talking about market assessments and this topic in general. I think it comes up a lot in our discussions in the COP and in many responses that we're working in. And I think there's some common pain points as well that we often find, particularly, well, with any sector, but in the shelter sector in particular, about how we adapt the kind of methodologies we have for market assessment and analysis to meet the needs of, you know, the information we have at the time that we have in the response. So in short, markets obviously play a critical role in the lives and livelihoods of communities affected by crisis. And considering markets in our response planning can make sure that we are supporting local markets and market actors rather than disrupting or bypassing them or indirectly doing harm, perhaps even without realizing. Um, and there's a broad spectrum of engaging with markets in emergency contexts and in crisis contexts. So we might use markets, for example, providing cash or voucher assistance for people to buy what they need in terms of shelter items and services from local markets, or we might procure from local vendors, or we might use local labourers to engage in our response. And then there's kind of a spectrum upwards of a kind of a more in-depth engagement with markets. So the second sort of level that we often talk about is supporting markets, and that might be where we are actively designing activities that would help existing market actors to either recover, like restart their work, or improve supply chains. So we may target, vendors of shelter materials to be able to restock or to repair their warehouses so that local markets can kind of function better following a shock. And then the third level, which we often don't do in emergencies, but as we move into kind of recovery and development, and it can also help with preparedness as well, is around developing markets, which, like I said, would be a longer term approach. And this is where we might work a little bit more kind of strategically to enhance the market system, to address key kind of constraints faced by our target populations in accessing certain shelter products or services from those markets, to improve kind of overall functionality and so that markets are better able to respond when another shock happens. And obviously, to design any of those types of programs, we kind of need to understand the market situation, for critical goods and services, to do that. Just to kind of plug, and we'll land at the end on this, that this is all kind of covered in a guidance note that the COP and the Shelter Cluster developed along with the Markets in Crisis Community of Practice, which is kind of an overview of market-based programming in the shelter sector. So we'll include the link to that at the end of the presentation. But that's a helpful reference to kind of understand a little bit more about market-based programming in general. And then just to remind us, obviously, this is just a snapshot of some examples, but when we think about shelter and settlement responses, there's actually a lot of different types of markets that we might touch on or engage with, or the households that we're trying to support may also rely on. So that's everything from commodities and materials, obviously like construction materials, tools, essential household items, more service-related markets like labour, which obviously has also a big range in terms of like different types of skill or unskilled labour that relate to construction or other specialised services. We also would need to consider like housing and land markets as well, including kind of rental properties and existing housing stock, financial services. Obviously, investment in shelter is large at the household level. So people may require access to different credit mechanisms for either repairing or reconstructing their shelter. There's also markets around legal services, as well as, tertiary is the wrong word, but like utilities as well, like energy, water, fuel, transport, that are all kind of required for people to have access to appropriate and adequate shelter as well. So that's just to set the scene about also why I think when we talk about market assessments in the shelter sector, it can quickly become quite complicated because our work does touch on a lot of different types of markets as well. So figuring out like what kind of information we need at what time can be tricky. And I think Chris is going to kind of touch on some of the approaches that we'll use, as well as how we navigate some of those challenges as well. So without further ado, I will hand over to Chris from Reach to give us a bit of an overview of market assessment approaches. And Chris, just let me know when you need me to advance the slides and I can click through.
Hey, great. Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny. My name is Chris Macy. I'm the Global Cash and Markets Assessment Specialist with Reach HQ and here in Geneva. And I'm also a member of the advisory committee for the Markets and Crises Community of Practice. It's not the first time I've been here with you today at the Shelter Cluster, and I'm glad to be back. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so when we were first discussing this presentation, we were sort of brainstorming some common questions that might come up. And one of the ones that came up is, when is it useful for us to have a shelter market assessment? Like, when is it useful to have the data that comes out of such an assessment? And my admittedly a bit biased answer is, if you can click forward a bit, almost always. It is almost always useful to have this sort of data available to us. And the reason I say that, if you can just click, um, is that markets are, this is a bit repeating some of this stuff that Jenny said in her initial remarks, but so markets are really at the center of life for many of the populations that we are aiming to help. They're sources not only of key goods, but also of livelihoods for all the people who are involved in producing those goods and bringing them to market. And so that alone means that all humanitarian programs, not just cash, not just shelter, but really everything, needs at a minimum to be market aware, both in order to avoid undermining those livelihoods and also in order to avoid duplicating systems that already exist. Next slide. So when we think about it, what is a market actually? So a market is an existing system for distributing essential goods to the people who need them. And if you think about it, this is precisely the goal of the systems that we are also trying to create for in-kind distributions and for things like that. We're trying to get essential goods to the people who need them. So then the natural question here is, when do we really need to create these parallel systems? And when do we run the risk of duplicating something that already exists? So in order to untangle that, one of the key questions that we need to ask is, are the existing market systems adequate to help households and communities construct or obtain adequate, resilient shelter? Uh, and if they are, then that's great. We can use those markets as they already exist. If they're not adequate, then are there ways that we can bolster or transform them in small ways to make sure that they become adequate for that purpose? And this is why we need market assessments. We need them to help us understand the answers to these questions, and also to understand the systems within which we're working, which is crucial for any type of humanitarian response. Next slide. Great, thank you. So when when I say that you almost always need to have a market assessment, some of you might be picturing something that's on the screen, like this sort of type of analysis, and it might alarm you a little bit. But actually, no. So what's on the screen right now is a market map, and this is a specific tool that's developed for it's derived from originally from a methodology called the EMMA and from value chain analysis before that. So this is emergency market mapping and analysis. Um, it was one of the first market assessment methodologies ever developed, and as such, it can be sort of the default that people think of whenever they think of the term market assessment at all. But so these are really valuable in certain situations, but you don't always necessarily need an EMMA. As we'll see, this is only one approach to market assessments, and there are many others. Many of them are much lighter touch, and they might be more precisely targeted towards your specific needs. So market assessments, they usually just try to answer two basic questions. So first of all is, does the market have the capacity to deliver all or part of the assistance that is needed? And second of all, whether or not it's functional, what type of support could improve the market's accessibility and functionality to make sure that it's even better suited to delivering aid in this way. Next slide. So the rest of this presentation is going to center mainly on a resource that the Markets in Crisis Community of Practice put out last year. And it's called the Comparison of Market Assessment Tools. It's available in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. And it's an update of a previous doc that was put together by IOC and CALP about a decade back, and it sort of took on new life in the revision process. And it has two main aims. Basically, it's trying to help practitioners select appropriate tools and methodologies for market assessments. And the second one, which is equally important, is that it's sort of trying to help you make sense of the chaos right? Like it's trying to give you frameworks for thinking about how to approach a market assessment so that you can understand which tool is most appropriate for your needs. And just sort of a quick aside, I guess, about the cash and markets world, which some of you might be more familiar with than others. So in the shelter sector, we are fortunate to have the Global Shelter Cluster as a sort of centralized body that is here to set standards, define indicators, refine common methodologies that all the country clusters will use, and things of that sort. In cash and markets, we don't really have anything quite comparable to this. We have lots of complementary standards and methodologies, sometimes competing standards and methodologies that are basically developed by any organization that has a good idea and that has enough staff and enough expertise to work on that idea. So it can end up being a bit confusing. It can end up being chaotic, but this document and hopefully this presentation as well can help you cut through some of the confusion and identify what are the methodologies that will work best for your particular situation. Next slide. So to start this process of trying to simplify this complex landscape, I would say that there are three main categories in which into which most market assessment toolkits would fall. So there's rapid market assessments, which aim to help humanitarian actors understand how markets have changed in the immediate aftermath of a shock. And then there's in-depth market assessments, which try to dig more deeply into how these market systems function and the different roles that different market actors play. And there can be a fair bit of overlap between these two. You can, in some cases, use the same toolkits at different scales and different scopes to be either rapid or in-depth. But then a little apart from those two is the third category, which is for recurring assessments and monitoring, which you can use to basically regularly track changes in market dynamics, market prices, market functionality, and things like that over time. So when considering which one of these categories your information needs fall into, um, it's helpful to ask ourselves two questions. First of all, what is the information that you actually need in order to design fully informed and market-aware shelter programming in this context? And second of all, which is equally important, is how much time do I have, and how much money do I have to get the data? Because you can design a perfect assessment that tells you everything that you've ever wanted to know about the timber market locally, but it's not going to be very useful if you're in a sudden onset crisis and partners need data by the end of the week to be able to design their programs. So that's something that it's important to consider when we consider what sort of assessment we are is going to be most valuable for our needs. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so let's start digging into these different categories, starting with rapid market assessments. So these are assessments that are conducted in the aftermath of a sudden shock to provide a snapshot of how market systems have been affected by that shock. Now, what do I mean by a shock? So in a sudden onset crisis, this can be something like an earthquake or a hurricane that leads to large-scale displacement or destruction of shelters. But it can also happen in a protracted crisis. For example, maybe there is a significant local shift in conflict dynamics. Maybe there's a period of heavy shelling, something that also causes heavy displacement and damage and basically changes the situation to the point where a new market assessment is helpful. So these rapid market assessments that are rolled out in this sort of situation, usually they focus on things like market functionality, accessibility, infrastructure in a defined physical area. Sometimes they can also collect some limited info on whether or not certain commodities are available on the markets. But the aim of all of this is to help humanitarian actors make rapid decisions about cash feasibility and which aid modalities are most effective. So it's important that they don't aim to answer every possible question because we don't have time in most of these rapid market assessment situations. We really just want a snapshot of how things look at the current moment. And the idea behind it is that if later on, ideally we'll have the resources to supplement this rapid assessment by more in-depth analysis or monitoring. Basically, we need to control the scope of these original rapid market assessments tightly in order to make sure they can be released quickly. Next slide. Okay, so there will be a few slides in this presentation where I am going to go through a couple of the key toolkits uh, that can be used for each different type of rapid market assessment. I won't go into a lot of detail, and the point is not to, have you memorize all of this or to have you sort of retain every single information about every toolkit. You will be receiving the slides afterwards, so if there is something that sounds interesting to you, you can just note it down. You can look it up later, and hopefully that will be helpful to you. So under rapid assessments, the first thing that I want to highlight is the Rapid Assessment for Markets, or the RAM toolkit from IFRC and ICRC. So this one basically aims to help you decide as rapidly as possible whether to launch a CVA or an in-kind response, and whether you need further market system analysis to make this decision. Then there is the MSMA, the Multi-Sector Market Assessment, done by UNHCR and NRC. So this is sort of rapid commodity-focused market analysis in a post-shock context, trying to establish whether or not CVA is feasible under the circumstances. And then there's EMMA, the Emergency Market Mapping and Analysis Toolkit, which I alluded to before. So this one focuses on deeper analysis of market systems. And the goal here is really to reconstruct what the supply chains look like for individual items of interest to us and create one of those market maps for each supply chain. And it can be done not only for items, but also for things like labor as well. If we think of labor as a commodity, where basically people are the ones supplying the commodity and employers are the ones who are consuming the commodity, we can analyze the labor market using many of the same methodologies as is used for markets of goods. Out of these three, I would say that the RAM is the only one that is unambiguously at its best as a rapid market assessment in emergency situations. The other two toolkits are great, but they're also heavier. And they can be done as rapid market assessments if you have a large number of staff. But arguably, they're even better in situations where you have the time and you have the resources to be able to do a more in-depth assessment, which I think is a good segue to the next slide. Okay, so jumping into in-depth market assessments now. So these are conducted after a crisis, not necessarily immediately after a crisis, but in the weeks and months and even years that follow, to build a more refined understanding of how local market systems function and how they have been disrupted by shocks. They try generally to assess full market systems in more depth and over a longer period of time, which might mean that you're able to expand your geographic scope to more areas or even to an entire country. You can assess more goods and services that you're interested in. You can dig more deeply into questions of market infrastructure and market environment. And often there is a focus here on trying to understand the main market actors and what role each one of them plays in the supply chain. Now, assessments like this can be used to sort of confirm or reevaluate aid modalities as programs scale upward as the response evolves. So basically confirming whether cash is still feasible or whether it has newly become feasible as things have changed. And it can also be very useful to inform the design of recovery programming. And you can understand that either as recovery from an immediate emergency or longer term recovery and early recovery after a protracted crisis. So it can be very useful in either of those situations. Next slide. Okay, so for some toolkits for in-depth market assessment methodologies, so I'll repeat here the EMMA and the MSMA. As I mentioned, they can arguably be of more value when they're used as methodologies for in-depth assessments, but they can also work as rapid assessments too. To that, I will add the market analysis guidance, also from IFRC and ICRC. So this is designed as sort of a more in-depth partner to the RAM. It's not necessarily a ready-made toolkit in the sense that you have to tailor each one of the tools to your specific situation. But it provides a really strong foundation for those who have the resources to do that. Um, and I also want to look at the pre-crisis market analysis, so the PCMA, a toolkit from IRC and Oxfam. So this one is a bit different from the others. It's not necessarily a defined toolkit. It's more of a flexible guidance on how to adapt other market assessment methodologies like the RAM, like the EMMA, or things like that, to help you establish market baselines and to help you predict how markets will respond if a shock occurs. Um, and this can sound a little strange at first because usually as humanitarians we are not necessarily present pre-crisis, but I think it has broader applicability than that in terms of establishing market baselines. So if you are fortunate to be working in a context that maybe is a bit more stable, perhaps in an early recovery or even a development stage, a PCMA can be something that you consider as something that can pay real dividends if a shock happens in the future. Next slide. Great. So for the final category, let's talk about the recurring assessments and monitoring. So these sorts of assessments are conducted on a regular basis post-shock to help us continually update our understanding of how the market situation is evolving. So they're meant to be done not just once, but iteratively, in several rounds over time. Um, and these tend to be most useful in crises or in contexts that are going to last for a while, whether that means a protracted crisis, an early recovery context, or even in a development context. This sort of monitoring can be extremely useful. And it can also, because it is iterative, you can make it something that's a quicker and lighter touch than a one-time market assessment. So it focuses on tracking the key contextual elements that are likely to change. And these can be things like the prices of key goods. You can track elements of market functionality to make sure that markets stay functional over time, the operational constraints that vendors are facing. And if you're interested in particular items and particular supply chains, you can track how those supply chains are recovering over time in response to humanitarian assistance. Um, for these sorts of assessments, it can often be helpful to set up larger collaboration systems surrounding them to try to ensure two things. Basically, that these assessments take place regularly, first of all, regularly enough to be of value. And second of all, that when they do take place, something actually happens as a result of it, to make sure that the data triggers meaningful changes in the response whenever the data says that those changes are needed. So it can be really helpful to have an explicit mechanism in place to make sure that we do have this regular rethink in response to data of the direction the response is heading and what should change as a result. Next slide. Great. So three toolkits that I want to highlight here. So the first one I want to highlight is the market. So this is the Market Monitoring Analysis and Response Kit from CRS. And this is a toolkit for program-based market monitoring, basically market monitoring that's meant to fit into sort of the context of individual programs or projects from a single organization. And it focuses on how to analyze prices as signals of market changes. And this can be appealing because it's sort of a smaller effort that can be it can be launched basically within the context of a single program to fulfill your specific information needs. Um, at the opposite end of the spectrum is the JMMI, or the Joint Market Monitoring Initiative from REACH. And this is a methodology that I've helped to build, actually. So I'm happy to answer any questions about it. But basically, the point here is to bring together as many cash actors as possible from throughout a response to collaboratively collect harmonized market data from their own areas of operation. It focuses mainly on supporting multi-purpose cache, but it's meant as a larger kind of response-wide monitoring program. So if there is a JMMI in place, it may mean that you don't actually need to collect additional market monitoring data. It may be that that data is already available to you. And then the last one I want to highlight is the Market Functionality Index from WFP. So this one, it doesn't quite fit into the recurring assessments category cleanly, but basically what it is a specialized methodology that assigns marketplaces a score on market functionality based on 9 different dimensions. And I have seen this one launched as a rapid assessment in specific areas to get a sense of market functionality there. I've also seen it launched as a recurring larger scale assessment for ongoing monitoring of market functionality in a certain country. So it can be really useful in both of those cases. And next slide. Okay, so we're approaching the end of the presentation. I want to return a bit back to the beginning. So we started out by asking whether we need a shelter market assessment, whether we need shelter market assessment data. And now I want to ask the question, do we need to be the ones to launch this? Do we actually need to roll out a new shelter market assessment ourselves? And my answer to that, if you can click, is maybe, maybe not. Depends on the situation. If you can just click, yeah, thank you. So basically, you need to do some scoping first to understand whether you actually do need to launch an assessment of your own. It could be very possible that the data that you need already exists, whether this is from past assessments or whether it's from current monitoring that is already being done. Before going ahead and launching a new program of yourself or of your own, it can be very valuable to consult with cluster members, not only, and also with the cache working group as well, not only on what has been done in the past, but what has been planned for the future, if there's something coming up that could be very valuable to you. And if there are ongoing joint assessment initiatives as well, things like the JMMI, things like a harmonized post-distribution monitoring that a lot of organizations participate in, it's also possible to see if these initiatives can help to fill your cluster's info gaps. Perhaps all they need is just a few indicators added or a few items added, and they can be useful for your purposes. So I would consider that as well. Next slide. So in considering whether the data that you have is enough to meet your needs, you can approach this question in a couple of different ways. So I would ask, first of all, is the available data, does it cover your locations of interest, or at least locations that are sufficiently close or sufficiently similar to those locations that you can still get valuable insight from the data that you have? I would also ask, is the data, does it include your supply chains or your items of interest? Or does it include something that's similar enough, again, that you can get some valuable insight from those assessments, understanding of how the markets work? Then I would ask, is the available data complete enough to give you reasonable insight into the questions you're trying to find out? Or is it maybe a bit patchy, a bit incomplete, that doesn't really give you a clear picture? Is it new enough to give you reasonable insight? Or is it out of date? And for this one, you can be flexible depending on the situation. You know, you might have an assessment of the construction labor market from 2011, which seems like it would be too old. But if you have real reasons to believe that the construction labor market would not have changed all that much since 2011, you can still get some valuable data from this very old assessment, and you can combine that with maybe a much smaller data collection exercise to update your understanding of how things have developed since then. And finally, I would ask, is the available data actually accessible to the people who need to use it? And this is an important consideration that's often forgotten, because there can be a perfect assessment that was done years ago, but if no one is able to get their hands on the report, or if no one is able to get their hands on the data for further analysis, then it's sort of as if it didn't exist, right? And often I find that this can be a challenge with data produced by governments. Often the data does exist somewhere within the government structures, but it's just almost impossible to get our hands on it in a time frame that is compatible with humanitarian interests. So this is something to think about as well. Again, with all of these, I would be flexible in how you think through all of these. I would allow for some variation in determining whether or not you can get anything valuable out of the secondary data you have. But if you have serious concerns about any of these points, that's when I would start considering to launch your own market assessment. And at that point, you can go back to the beginning of this presentation and you can start thinking through some of the associated considerations there, and you can decide what assessment would meet your needs the best. Okay, so thank you very much. I will leave it at that. On the slide, you have links to the document in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic, which you can review after this. And yeah, thank you very much for your time. I hope it was useful.
Thank you so much, Chris. I have no doubt that that was extremely useful for many people. And I would encourage everyone to continue to put some questions in the chat. I can just see that Ria has put one in there. And I think we'll come back to that after we've heard from David, who's going to put some, a practice example in place around a planned market assessment that is taking place in the West Bank. I'll hand over to you, David.
Great, thank you, Leanne, and thank you, Chris. And I'm going to probably touch upon many of the things that you mentioned there, Chris, in terms of thinking about the depth of the rental assessment, and also thinking about how we use secondary data and the sort of like time and resources that we have to be able to do this. So maybe we can go to the next slide and I can just explain the context a little bit more. I'm currently working as the technical coordinator with the Palestine Shelter Cluster, and in the West Bank, I know at the moment a lot of eyes are sort of focused on Gaza, but in the West Bank at the moment there's ongoing military operations in the refugee camps. There's quite a lot of particularly in the west towards Area C, there is settlement violence, there's a lot of displacement that's ongoing. So this rental market assessment that we are proposing, so it's planned, it hasn't started yet, we're developing the tools. It's in response to 8,000 households who are displaced from some of the refugee camps and have had to have moved into, and it's about 65% we think are renting, and about 20% seem to be staying in hosted arrangements. There's an ongoing household level assessment at the moment. And that picture that you can see at the bottom, that is just an example of the refugee camps that people were displaced from, and you can get a sense that these aren't tented camps. People were living in sort of in cities essentially. And what we know at the moment is that there's ongoing rental assistance. So agencies, as a sort of emergency response, provided around $300 a month for 3 months. But at some point quite soon, that cash will run out. And the hope was that those people would be able to return to and rebuild. But operations are ongoing. We don't know how long this displacement is going to last. And the reason I'm giving you this context is because it's really important in thinking about then what we do, what the objectives are for our rental market assessment. And one of the key things is that we want to look at what's the next bit of programming. So that could be further rental assistance with perhaps some livelihood support, although livelihoods is very difficult in the West Bank. Upgrades of substandard buildings for rent-free period, and there might be other options. So this ongoing household level assessment is also asking households like what they're planning to do next and looking for ideas in terms of future programming. Before we go on, I want to just tell you a little bit more about this the data that's being collected in this ongoing household level assessment. So with those 8,000 households that are displaced to the north, the sample size to try and get a representative sample is about 3,700 households that are being surveyed. And the assessment includes questions on well, what sort of settlement scenario they're in, so whether they are renting, whether they're hosting. It includes information on how much rent they're paying, whether they're at risk of eviction. It talks about the sorts of accommodation they're currently in terms of the number of rooms. There's a question there on size. I'm not sure what sort of data we're going to get out of that, but it includes access to, do you have access to kitchens, do you have access to bathrooms? So it includes a lot of information that we can eventually incorporate into our rental market assessment. It also includes a whole load of information, general things like do you have some form of income generating activity? It includes information on food security, on WASH. So we're going to use that as a really substantial bit of secondary data to feed into our rental market assessment. Should we go on to the next slide? Yeah. So this has only just been presented to the strategic advisory group for the West Bank for that shelter cluster. So I'll just pick up on some of the objectives, and they'll probably be very common to anybody who's undertaken rental market assessments or been involved in rental assistance. So we really want to understand a bit more about rental market practices. So the current ongoing household assessment isn't picking up on rental market practices in terms of sort of are written or verbal agreements being undertaken, are there payments in advance, are there deposits? So we really want to pick up on some of that information. We know that some of the agencies have been doing rental assistance for years, so we will be, if just not in this particular area, not at this scale, so we will be engaging with all of those agencies that have been already working in this area to sort of try and understand more about what they already know. So the first stage will be key informant interviews with just those agencies that are currently working in this area. Some of the other objectives, we need to understand how they're not IDPs, they're displaced refugees, choose locations, find accommodation, why they choose those locations and those accommodation. We need to look at, we need to set our minimum housing standards, our minimum security of tenure. So we've got quite a lot of objectives that are sort of quite outside of just looking at price and supply. We're really looking at a lot of other things in this assessment. So let me just pick up on one or two other things there. Also, as part of our assessment, we're going to talk about protection, gender and inclusion concerns. So who can't access the rental housing market? What we want to understand about the threat of exploitation, eviction risks. We want to understand a little bit about how people find accommodation. Do they use informal brokers? Is it just all word of mouth? Are there any online platforms or any print media that people use to find accommodation? And then finally, we want to tie into this assessment because everybody's very busy, and if we're going to do key informant interviews, we might as well use it to tie in some other questions. We're going to tie in that final point on the assessment of the feasibility of the follow-up programming around upgrades of substandard buildings for a reduced rent period. Should we go to the next slide? So our methodology, and it's a very rapid rental market assessment. We're not going to be looking at depth at how we can make market system change to be able to make those sort of bigger bits of change. We don't have the resources to do that, and we also there's very few agencies who are willing to at this stage, because they're just so busy, willing to engage in this assessment at this moment. Although they're all interested, it's just putting their hand up and volunteering some staff time is difficult. And I can see actually there's Lana on the call here, who is one of the SAG members who has offered to volunteer some staff time. So thank you. in terms of the process then, so the first bit, we're forming a small working group interested in this assessment. Currently, we've got two agencies who are interested. I want to get that up to 4. So when I start those key informant interviews with those agencies already doing rental market assessment, I'm going to be chatting them up, and I'll hope they'll join. Sorry, who are already doing rental market assistance, I'll be asking them if they'll be interested in undertaking and supporting this assessment. We need to confirm the geographical area of interest. So is it in the places that displaced refugees are currently, the villages that they're currently? So yes, but also are there other places that people could be potentially supported to, so that if things are slightly cheaper, if but they still have the networks and they still have livelihood access, etc. So are there other places outside of where people are currently displaced? We need to confirm that geographical area. We need to undertake that stakeholder mapping. Who is it we want to speak to? Is it landlords? Is it are there any sort of associations? Is it the Bureau of Statistics? Tenants? So informal brokers. How do people find accommodation? Are there any sort of stakeholders there that we want to have key informant interviews with? And then there's that whole secondary data analysis. So I think Chris mentioned this a number of times. So we want to try and limit our primary data collection as much as possible. We really want to know what already exists there. So we know that agencies have been carrying out rental assistance for a long while. There hasn't been a recent rental market assessment, and also things have really changed. Having 8,000 households with 65% currently reporting living in rental accommodation up in the north, that's really impacted that market. So we know that we need to undertake a rental market assessment. We know that there's a lot of base information, perhaps around rental practices, other things that are already out there. So we will do that secondary data analysis, and we'll also feed in that 3,700 bits of data from our household level assessment, where we might have quite a lot of rental price information already from that. Then we need to think about what rental housing market we're interested in. Does this involve people renting rooms? Does this involve people renting whole apartments? We want to define the accommodation unit. So what is it we're really interested in? And then we will start our primary data collection. And if we go to the next slide, I'll tell you about that, but it's very rapid. So I think this is probably the bare minimum we can get away with. And we're putting it at the bare minimum because we haven't got the resources to be able to do this in more depth. And also in terms of our programming, we may not need to do it in more depth. The follow-on program, in terms of our follow-on programming, we sort of need to like cut our cloth. I can't remember the phrase, cut our cloth to suit. So here, these are just some of the key informants that we're going to pick up on, and then later, once we've done that, so hopefully the agencies will undertake those key informant interviews. Some of them can be done remotely, some of them will have to visit in person. We might do focus group discussions with renter households rather than key informant interviews. And then hopefully that information will come back in English, and I will help to sort of generate and write that report. And then we'll look at what that means for our guidance, our follow-on programming. If you go to some of the next slides, I'll just explain some of our thinking on why this, how we got to this methodology. Oh, okay. So here are some of the resources that I've been using to generate the key informant interview questions, and also to look at our methodology. I'll share the links to this after the call. Okay, and the next one. So why is it such a light touch rapid assessment? Westbank Travel Cluster partners really have very limited time to engage. They're busy with their programming. There's also this current ongoing household assessment. There's the time frame is also impacted by not only current programming, but also in future. What are we going to do with this information? We think there's a very limited funding to be able to do a lot of sort of upgrades to substandard buildings for a rent-free period. We know that we probably will continue with some rental assistance, but again, it's going to be a lot more targeted, a lot more limited. And we'll also, part of the reason why this is so rapid and light touch is we're getting some good data out of this ongoing household assessment, and we think that this is a good enough start. So That's all I wanted to share with you on the West Bank assessment. As I said, it's planned, it hasn't started. Things might change a bit, but I think I'll hand back to Leanne. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, David. I think that was super interesting for me to hear how you're approaching this, and I'm sure it was for everyone else. So as we mentioned before, we want to have a little bit of a discussion now. So I think there's a number of questions in the chat, so people can continue to keep putting them there. But I think we might pick a few that might be good for general discussion. I know, Jenny, you have started to answer some of the questions from Ria around coordinating interagency market assessments. But if you would like to say anything on that, Ria, feel free to unmute.
Hi, thanks everyone. And thank you for the presentations. They were really straightforward and incredibly helpful. I'm glad to see that there's been a comparison of the tools that we've been seeing for so many years, but just actually having them in place to understand which should be used or which are recommended to be used when. I found that it's extremely helpful. Yeah, I think I'm a year into my shelter sector journey, so some of the questions I have might be quite obvious to everyone else, but I'm thinking partly because of the way that my organization works, but also because of I suppose the technicality of the of looking at the cost of shelter items and the fact that supply chain and procurement might often be more involved in analyzing that from an organizational lens. I think what I've been curious about is seeing, like my background and experience is a lot in food security and livelihoods and cash resistance. So coming from WFP and other organizations where it's a bit more straightforward in a way where you see a lot of JMMIs, covering food items and a limited amount of NFI and shelter items, so that when we do want to understand more around, let's say, more in-depth shelter related items, it's a question of, okay, how do we usefully create, or like, do we need to create an assessment, I think as Chris was saying, that will answer our questions around that, or do we recommend that the existing assessments be expanded, and how do we do that at an organizational level where we might have supply chain looking at like international procurement versus local procurement, but without having a specific programmatic lens to it. That's a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts, but that's kind of what's been going on in my mind when I was listening to Chris's very in-depth and helpful presentation. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Ria. And I think it's a really good question, a really pertinent question. I think there's a couple questions in there actually. So yeah, in terms of sort of having these more collaborative assessments that do not necessarily meet more specialized needs of shelter partners or the shelter cluster in general. Sometimes that is the case. Sometimes, like just from my own experience with running JMMIs, sometimes we're sort of bound to having to monitor all of the items in the MEB so that we can calculate the MEB, and leaves maybe limited space for some shelter items to be added. So I would say that there's always some capacity to add a few representative items into assessments like this, to sort of give us some idea of how markets are traveling in general. But it might not be possible to add everything, in which case, as you said, you would be looking at a sort of more specialized assessment. And you also asked about recommendations about sort of launching these sort of assessments collaboratively, specifically the rapid assessments and the in-depth assessments. I would say to that they can certainly be done, especially I think the rapid assessments can be extremely effective when they're done collaboratively. Actually, in Reach, we have a methodology called the JRAM that we use, which is essentially the RAM from ICRC, but done as a joint assessment with bringing a bunch of partners together. And the strength of that is that you can kind of bring together everybody's contributions and have a much wider coverage and a much more broad statements that you can make than you were able to before. But there is a cost of that, and the cost is in time and it's in rapidity, frankly, because collaboration is something that takes additional time. And in some cases, it is actually quicker to work independently and to get the data out as fast as possible. Which is a terrible thing to say. Maybe I shouldn't even say it, but it is a consideration. In Reach, most of the time, the calculation that we make is that um, the benefits of collaboration far outweigh the costs of collaboration, which is why we try to do these assessments as collaboratively as possible. But I can understand the sort of alternative uh, stance on that. As for in-depth assessments, they're also perfectly possible to do collaboratively, but more complicated because the methodologies themselves tend to be much more complicated and in-depth. So when you start doing it across multiple organizations, you start running into problems of, well, how can we make sure that everybody is trained in a uniform way? How can we make sure that multiple organizations are all following this same complex methodology exactly out in the field so that we can compare all of their data? And it becomes more difficult in that sense, which is why it's more rarely done. But it is certainly possible, and it's something that we've done before. So yeah, I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, really helpful. Thanks so much.
Thanks a bunch, Chris. I'm just conscious of time and we do want to get you away on time. So I might just give one more question out for us to discuss in this call, but letting you know that we always follow up all of the webinars with written answers to questions that have been asked in the chat. So even if you think we're running out of time, feel free to put something in the chat. We will come back to those questions as we send out the notes. So I might do a slightly maybe quicker one just because of the time. I will go to Denise's second question. Hello, Denise. And maybe throw that to David. Denise's question is around current rental market is in short supply in Europe, and it's a trend expanding in other regions, and you've seen that in the West Bank. How easy or hard are you still finding it to provide rental assistance with this challenge?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult because it's also about providing meaningful rental assistance where at the end of the supported period, people are able to then continue renting or be able to return or find another sort of exit strategy. So I think in some of these situations where there's seriously a shortage of supply, it actually and there's a lot of inflation and prices are quite high, and I think it actually needs us to think a lot more about, firstly, who do we support that has meaningful exit strategies, which sometimes is a bit of a problem because it might mean that we're not supporting the most vulnerable, but we have to think of rental assistance as only sitting within a menu of other shelter interventions, and so maybe there are other things that we need to be supporting people with those things. I can't actually answer Denise's question because it's quite a difficult one. I was hoping you were going to ask me the next one, the last one she posted.
Oh, the one. Well, you can answer that one if you have a simple answer to
Okay.
it. Absolutely.
So Chris
What's
might
the
have a
simplest
different idea, and Jenny yourself as well. You might have a different idea. But for me, I found one of the easiest tools to pick up was the RAM, was the ICRC IFRC rapid assessment of markets, because it just like all of the questions were sort of all in the one book, and it I know it's very like much more around sort of shelter construction materials you can use it for, but it felt very easy and get like I could just engage with it very easily. I don't know whether Chris, you have like in the last 30 seconds, you have a comment on that.
I was actually going to say the RAM as well. I think that's I've also find that to be sort of very self-contained, very easy to use. The only caution that I would make is that it is, as I mentioned before, it is most valuable in a rapid assessment context. So a lot of times there's a temptation to sort of use rapid assessment methodologies in contexts where deeper in-depth assessment is what's needed. So yeah, if you have the resources and the time, maybe something else is better to go with. But if you are in a rapid onset situation, then a RAM would be a really good option to go with.
Excellent. Thanks both. And I see, Jenny, you've said that you agree in the chat, so that's great. So I just very quickly wrap things up. As we've shared a few of these already, and we will also share this slide deck after the call for everyone that's been here. But just wanted to know that they've got all those resources. But for those who aren't in the Shelter Cash and Markets community of practice, it depends on how you got to this call today. But we do have the forum on the Global Shelter Cluster website. We've got a Shelter Cash and Markets community of practice WhatsApp group within the wider humanitarian shelter team. And also you can register to be on our mailing list to continue to be in the loop for all of these ongoing webinars and conversations. And also feel free to email us via any of, or contact us via any of those platforms to suggest other topics for us to continue to talk about as we go on. And as I said, don't stress. All of the questions that you've asked in the chat, we will come back to with questions in our follow-up from this webinar. But on the interest of time, I will hand over, maybe Jenny, if you have any final words.
No, nothing from my side. Just a huge thanks to David and Chris in particular for sharing all of your experience and expertise. I feel like we could have chatted for hours about this. It's hard to condense into 1 hour, but I hope people have found it useful. So thank you both so much for joining us.
Yes, and just echoing those thanks. Thank you. It just really helps to make it tangible for everyone. And I think that we can see with everyone's reactions on the webinar now that it's much appreciated. So thanks everyone for joining. Thanks again, David and Chris, and thanks to Jenny as well. We'll see you on the next one.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.